Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Electoral College, a biography of America's peculiar creation through the eyes of the people who shaped it, by Thomas E. Weaver. Read by Steve Menasche. Introduction. A Tale of Two Vice Presidents. On February 11, 1801, Congress met for the fourth time for the purpose of counting the Electoral College certificates of the various states from the presidential election of the previous fall, a story we will explore in more detail in Chapter 4. Vice President Thomas Jefferson presided over the session, acting in his capacity as President of the Senate. Proceeding roughly from north to south, from New Hampshire to Georgia, each of the certificates was opened by one of three congressional tellers and handed to Jefferson, who announced its contents. As he neared the end of his task, the results, which had been anticipated for weeks, were clear. Jefferson and Aaron Burr had tied. According to the constitutional provisions in effect at the time, in the event of a tie, the House of Representatives was required to select the president from the two contenders, with each state receiving exactly one vote. When Vice President Jefferson received the last certificate, however, Senator William Wells, one of the tellers, noticed that Georgia's electors, although apparently intending to cast 4 votes for Jefferson and 4 votes for Burr, had generated an election certificate defective on its face. Wells handed the certificate to Jefferson, commenting loud enough to be overheard that he was undecided as to the proper course to be pursued by the tellers. Rather than sign and certify a list of all persons voted for, as required by Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, the Georgia certificate simply contained a list of names. Noticeably absent from the certificate was the certification that the men whose names were listed under Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, in fact, voted for those two men. The deficiencies in the Georgia certificate of 1800 are made clearer when compared to the Georgia certificate of 1796, which contains the requisite certification. The 1796 certificate states the electors met at a place directed for the electors to meet for the election of president, where Thomas Jefferson of Virginia received 4 votes and George Clinton of New York received 4 votes. It concludes, "We, the underwritten electors, do certify the above to be a true list of the votes cast, followed by 4 signatures." What went through Jefferson's mind when he was handed the defective certificate? Jefferson's prospects in the expected House vote were far from certain. Although Jefferson and Burr were from the same political party, the Democratic Republicans, the majority of representatives belonged to the Federalist Party, which deemed Burr the better candidate. Did Jefferson contemplate discounting the Georgia certificate entirely? This would have prevented either Jefferson or Burr from receiving a majority of the Electoral College votes, and, according to the Constitution, opened up the House election to the 5 top candidates, a group that included John Adams, the incumbent president and member of the Federalist Party. Even more radical, did Jefferson contemplate counting Georgia's 4 votes for himself and discounting its 4 votes for Burr, making himself the sole person to receive a majority of the votes and avoiding a House vote entirely? Whether these or any other thoughts flashed through Jefferson's mind is unknown. What is known is that Jefferson proceeded with barely a pause, as if the Georgia certificate was facially valid, announcing 4 votes, each for himself and Burr. As one newspaper tersely summarized the events later that month, the votes from Georgia were rather informal, but accepted. 22 decades later, at precisely 12:59 on the afternoon of January 6, 2021, Congress again convened for the purpose of counting the electoral certificates. As had been true in 1801, the anticipated result of the Electoral College vote was well known. Everyone in attendance knew that, barring any unforeseen circumstance, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden would be formally elected the 46th President of the United States by a vote of 306 to 232 against his opponent, President Donald J. Trump. As had also been true in 1801, the man presiding over the session, Vice President Michael R. Pence, was a major candidate running for a second term as Vice President. As Vice President Pence led the 100 senators across the Capitol building and into the House chamber, President Trump was just finishing a speech he had begun an hour earlier in front of the White House. In the speech, Trump claimed to have won this election by a landslide, accused Democrats of election fraud, and faulted weak Republicans for turning a blind eye to the fraud. Trump exhorted his followers to never give up, never concede. In particular, Trump took aim at Vice President Pence, calling on him to do the right thing while certifying the Electoral College votes, urging him to somehow use his role as President of the Senate to disrupt or change the election results. According to Trump, states want a revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people. Like Jefferson before him, there was an apparent opportunity for the man entrusted with safeguarding America's democracy to alter the results of the election, and Trump was calling on Pence to do just that. On Election Day, November 3, 2020, there were many that believed the election could be a repeat of what had happened in 2016, with Trump losing the popular vote but prevailing in the Electoral College. Close races in states like Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona made that a possibility. In the final tally, however, Biden won most of the close states, securing both the popular and electoral vote. President Trump's reaction to the loss was as forceful as it was unprecedented. Refusing to concede the election, he repeatedly accused Democrats of fraud and corruption, despite a lack of credible evidence. Judges systematically dismissed scores of lawsuits filed in state and federal courts on behalf of the Trump campaign, noting they were without legal or factual foundation. Still, President Trump persisted in his claims. As the official date for counting the election certificates approached, there was, for the first time in American history, the realistic threat that the transfer of power from one president to the next would be accompanied by violence and insurrection. The final step in the presidential election process is for states to send election certificates to Washington announcing their Electoral College votes. According to current congressional rules, on the first Wednesday of January, the certificates are opened and counted, assuming the certificate appears in regular form and authentic, and absent a timely objection. At the conclusion of the session, the President and Vice President are formally announced. Objections must be made in writing, signed by at least one representative and one senator, and allege clearly and concisely without argument that the vote or votes were not regularly given. Upon receipt of an objection, the two chambers separate and take debate on the objection for up to 2 hours before taking a vote. In order for the objection to be sustained, a majority of both the House of Representatives and the Senate must agree that the objection is valid. As January 6 approached, Trump called for his supporters to gather outside the White House for a Save America rally to protest the congressional vote. Thousands responded. The rally began at 9 a.m. with speeches from multiple Trump supporters, including his son, Donald Trump Jr., and personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Just before noon, Trump himself joined the crowd and began his hour-long speech. Trump concluded the speech with a call to action. "And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give. The Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything, not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need our help. We're going to try and give them the pride and boldness that they need to take back our country." As Trump gave the speech, supporters started breaking away, walking along Pennsylvania Avenue toward the Capitol. When they arrived, they confronted the Capitol Police standing in front of the building. At the end of the speech, the remaining supporters started the 1.5-mile trek to the Capitol building. At 1:05 p.m., as Vice President Pence entered the House chamber, his staff released a public letter announcing he would not do anything to interfere with the electoral count, saying, "My oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority." The opening of the electoral certificates, per current congressional rules, commenced with Alabama and proceeded in alphabetical order. Alabama's certificate appeared to be in regular form and authentic, and announced 9 electoral votes to Trump for president and 9 electoral votes to Pence for vice president. No objections were noted. Alaska likewise cast its 3 votes for Trump and Pence. Again, no objections were noted. Next came the certificate of Arizona, which cast its 11 votes for Biden for president and Kamala D. Harris for vice president. This time, Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona, joined by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, objected in writing, stating the electoral votes were, under all the circumstances known, not regularly given. A proper objection having been lodged, the 2 chambers separated to debate the objection. The time was 1:12. For nearly 2 hours, representatives and senators stood in their respective chambers, giving speeches in favor of or opposing the objection. In the House of Representatives, 11 speeches were made, 6, all Republicans, in favor of the objection, and 5, all Democrats, against. In the Senate, something different happened. The first Senate speech was made by then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Unlike his Republican colleagues on the House side, the senator chose to speak not in favor of the objection nor in favor of Trump, but in support of the Electoral College. The time was 1:35. He argued, "If this election were overturned by mere allegations from the losing side, our democracy would enter a death spiral. We would never see the whole nation accept an election again. Every 4 years would be a scramble for power at any cost. The Electoral College, which most of us on this side have been defending for years, would cease to exist, leaving many of our states with no real say at all in choosing a president. The effects would go even beyond the elections themselves. Self-government, my colleagues, requires a shared commitment to the truth and a shared respect for the ground rules of our system." In response to Trump's claims that he had won by a landslide, McConnell noted. This election actually was not unusually close. Just in recent history, 1976, 2000, and 2004 were all closer than this one. The Electoral College margin is almost identical to what it was in 2016. While Congress continued about its business inside, the Trump supporters outside the Capitol continued theirs. They breached the barricades, pushing the Capitol Police closer and closer to the building. At approximately 2:15, the first Trump supporters entered the Capitol, first by breaking a window and climbing through, and then through doors opened from the inside. A recess was hastily called in both chambers while representatives and senators scattered to their offices or other hiding places. Vice President Pence was quickly escorted out of the Senate chamber by the Secret Service, narrowly missing a confrontation with the rioters. A tweet from President Trump at 2:24 announced, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." Within moments of the tweet, the rioters were demanding, "Where's Mike Pence?" In front of the Capitol building, a group of Trump supporters installed makeshift gallows and chanted, "Hang Mike Pence." After nearly 6 hours, order was finally restored, allowing the Senate to reconvene at 8:06 and the House at 9:02. In the Senate, Vice President Pence made the first speech, proclaiming, "To those who wreaked havoc in our Capitol today, you did not win. Violence never wins. Freedom wins. And this is still the people's house." Senator McConnell spoke second, building on the words he had declared prior to the attack. "This failed attempt to obstruct the Congress, this failed insurrection, only underscores how crucial the task before us is for our republic." At 3:11 a.m., Congress concluded its constitutionally mandated task of counting and certifying the electoral votes. The final vote was as anticipated, 306 for Biden/Harris, 232 for Trump/Pence. Just as had happened 2 centuries earlier, when Jefferson also had the opportunity to disrupt the count to his own advantage, every vote had been counted and the results certified. To paraphrase Senator McConnell, the insurrectionists had failed to shake us from our shared commitment to the truth and the ground rules of our system as laid out in our Constitution. The events of January 6, 2021, almost too recent to be considered history, are just the latest episode in the 2.5-century story of the Electoral College. Criticized by many, praised by some, understood by few, the Electoral College has existed as long as the Constitution itself. This book began as a project of genuine exploration after the contested election of 2016, when, for the 5th time in American history, a person who lost the popular vote was elected president. I felt instinctively that there was something to be gained by going back and looking at the Electoral College with fresh eyes. Why did the founders opt to have the country's chief executive chosen by neither Congress nor the people? Is the Electoral College an antiquated relic of a time long past, or does it have continued relevancy? The Electoral College is the peculiar creation of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, what Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Joseph ELLIS calls an odd inspiration. Alexander Hamilton, responding shortly after the Constitutional Convention of 1787 to a variety of criticisms to the document, called the Electoral College almost the only part of the system of any consequence which has escaped without severe censure. Hamilton expressed the opinion that while not perfect, it was at least excellent. But once enacted, the Electoral College has been subjected to early, consistent, and withering criticism. Critics have called it antiquated, irrelevant, archaic and immoral, clumsy, useless, racist, and viciously, unnecessarily undemocratic. The election of 1800, which had exposed glaring defects, had forced major modifications to the Electoral College in the form of the 12th Amendment. Representative George McDuffie of South Carolina, speaking nearly a year before the contested election of 1824, concluded that while the Electoral College was originally believed to be the most unexceptional provision of the Constitution in 1787, it had proved over time to be the most imperfect. When it comes to the original provisions of the Constitution, only slavery and less than universal suffrage have been more criticized than the Electoral College. Yet while the former two have been corrected by constitutional amendment or judicial fiat, the Electoral College persists. This is true despite the fact that there have been more proposed constitutional amendments to modify or eliminate the Electoral College than any other topic, with the possible exception of equal rights for women. In fact, the first such proposal came in July of 1788 from the New York Ratification Convention, just 10 months after the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention and nearly a year before George Washington was sworn in as the country's first president. Despite nearly 2.5 centuries of criticism, the Electoral College has shown remarkable durability and resilience. The purpose of this book is to understand why. We will analyze the Electoral College carefully from all angles, its strengths, weaknesses, proponents, and opponents. But this is not a scholarly analysis accessible only to law professors or policy wonks. Rather than present names, dates, places, numbers, and statistics in their raw form, this book tells the story of the Electoral College through the eyes of the people who lived it and shaped it. Rather than being a partisan pitch to either abolish or retain the Electoral College, it illustrates the ways in which the system has failed and the ways in which it has succeeded. In each chapter, you'll find the broader story of the Electoral College as it relates to several key elections, as well as analysis of legal aspects of the Electoral College. Most important, though, are the stories of people and events that helped to shape the Electoral College. From major figures, such as George Washington and James Madison, to everyday people such as James Watson, a former slave voting in his first presidential election. Although some names, primarily of affluent white males, will likely be familiar, many of the highlighted stories of black people, women, and everyday citizens have previously been relegated to only minor footnotes or never told at all. This is true even though the story of the Electoral College and the story of American slavery are inseparably intertwined and were so from the beginning. America's peculiar institution, as slavery was euphemistically called in the 19th century by polite society, was explicitly recognized in the 1787 Constitution and profoundly affected the way the founders envisioned the Electoral College. And long after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, its impact continues, creating a legacy that many argue still impacts the Electoral College today. Film documentarian Michael Moore may have expressed this view best shortly after Donald Trump won in 2016 by observing the irony that a man who repeatedly made racist comments on the campaign trail would benefit from a law from the 1700s to placate the slave states. In 1787, a group of men who had experienced despotic rule and revolution firsthand created an election framework they hoped would stand against the threat of monarchical and totalitarian control. In doing so, they compromised on many of their other ideals. Espousing democracy, they chose a system that is inherently undemocratic. Claiming that all men are created equal, they justified a system where large swaths of the population were disenfranchised, enslaved, or both. Yet that criticism brings us back to January 6, 2021, when a group of rioters stormed the Capitol building to pressure Vice President Pence and members of Congress to do what Vice President Jefferson had declined to do: reject the election certificates and undo the election results. Reviewing the events of that day, I cannot help but ponder whether, flawed though it may be, the Electoral College won when it mattered most, when violence and insurrection upended our cherished history of the peaceful transfer of power. Had the founders, in fact, created a system best equipped to prevent the despotism they fought a revolution to overcome? Chapter 1. The Election of 1836. Mr. Johnson Goes to Washington. In almost 250 years of United States presidential elections, only once, on February 8, 1837, has the Senate been called upon to choose a vice president. As required by the 12th Amendment, if any person fails to secure a majority of the Electoral College votes for vice president, the Senate chooses the vice president from the top two vote-getters. In the election of 1836, although the Democratic candidate and President Andrew Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren of New York, received the electoral majority required to win outright with 170 Electoral College votes out of a possible 294, his running mate, Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky, received only 147 votes. The vice presidential election moved to the Democratic-controlled Senate to choose between Johnson and the second-place finisher, Whig Party candidate Francis Granger of New York. Johnson was promptly elected vice president on the first ballot. The election of 1836 has often been relegated to the footnotes of American history, better suited for barroom trivia than serious scholarship. But a more careful examination of the events of the 1836 election reveals important facts about American political history in general and the Electoral College specifically. Johnson had come to national attention in much the same way as his political mentor, Andrew Jackson. Just as the turning point in Jackson's career had been his victory of the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, the turning point of Johnson's career was the Battle of the Thames during the same war. Until then, Johnson was a minor representative from the state of Kentucky. When war was declared on Britain, Johnson raised up a small battalion of Kentucky volunteers and joined General William Henry Harrison near Detroit, in what is now southern Ontario, to engage a force of British and Native American soldiers. During the ensuing battle, Representative, now Colonel, Johnson led 20 soldiers into a swamp swarming with enemy soldiers led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh. What happened next, according to historian Christina Snyder, lives in the shadowlands between history and myth. Johnson emerged bloody and disoriented, riding an equally bloody horse. Behind him, Tecumseh lay dead in the swamp, apparently at Johnson's hand. In 1824, when Andrew Jackson won a plurality but not a majority of both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, Johnson supported Jackson's presidential bid. When the House of Representatives chose instead to make John Quincy Adams the president, a story we'll explore in depth in Chapter 5, Johnson declared himself a Jacksonian for life, a pledge from which he never wavered.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?